The air in the grand ballroom of the Aurelian Hotel felt different tonight. It was thicker, heavy with the scent of 1,000 expensive perfumes mingling with the sweet, almost overpowering fragrance of lilies in towering centerpieces. For Clara, it was the smell of a different world, a world she was only visiting. She moved through the sea of silk and tuxedos like a ship in a busy harbor. Her black uniform, a stark contrast to the vibrant colors and shimmering jewels around her. In her hands, a heavy silver tray felt like an extension of her own arms, balanced with the ease of long practice. On it, flutes of champagne bubbled, capturing the light from the massive chandeliers, hanging above like frozen waterfalls. But Clara's mind wasn't on the tray or the guests. It was miles away, in a small, soundproofed room at the city's conservatory. In her head, her fingers were not carrying a tray. They were flying across the ivory keys of a grand piano, navigating the thunderous, complex passages of a Chopin etude. The rhythm of her steps, the gentle sway as she avoided a laughing guest in a sequined gown. It all matched the tempo of the music only she could hear. This was her secret, her escape. To the people in this room, she was a waitress, a function, a shadow that brought them drinks and cleared their plates. They saw the uniform, the polite smile, the efficient hands. They didn't see the artist, the dreamer, the young woman who fell asleep with sheet music spread across her bed and woke up with melodies in her head at 22. Clara was on the cusp of everything and nowhere at all. She was a senior, one of the most promising pianists her professors had ever seen. Praised for a touch that was both powerful and deeply sensitive. Her dream was a stage like this one, but not filled with diners. She imagined it packed with silent, rapt listeners, there for one reason only, to hear her play. But dreams, she had learned, were expensive. The conservatory tuition was a mountain. And every shift she worked at the Aurelian was another small shovel of dirt moved away from its base. This job was her means to an end, a necessary bridge between the life she had and the life she desperately wanted. Most nights, she could keep the two worlds separate. She could wear the uniform like a costume, play the part of the invisible server, and clock out with her tips. Her mind already racing back to a difficult arpeggio or a new interpretation of a sonata. Tonight, however, the gilded cage felt more constricting than usual. The laughter seemed louder, more brittle. The diamonds seemed brighter, more cold. She watched a man near the head table hold court, his booming voice cutting through the polite hum of conversation like a foghorn. He was older, with a face flushed from good wine and self-importance, his expensive suit looking a little too tight around his middle. People hung on his every word, their laughter a little too eager, their nods a little too deep. This was his kingdom, and they were his loyal subjects. Clara had seen his type before. Men who believed their wealth gave them ownership over everything and everyone around them. She made a mental note to avoid his section of the room, a skill she had honed to an art form. She glided along the perimeter of the room, her eyes scanning for empty glasses and knowing glances. She replaced a napkin here, collected a plate there, her movements fluid and practiced. She was a ghost, and that's how she preferred it. The less she was noticed, the smoother the night went, and the sooner she could be back in her small apartment, her fingers on the keys of her second-hand upright piano, the one that had a slight buzz on the C-sharp but was her most treasured possession. She was just turning towards the service kitchen when she heard it. A sound that was designed to cut through noise, to command attention. A sharp, aggressive snap of fingers. It wasn't a polite "excuse me." It was the sound a farmer might use to call a dog. Every muscle in Clara's body tensed. She didn't need to look to know who it was. The sound had come from the direction of the booming voice, from the man who held court like a king. She took a slow, steadying breath, the chop-in in her head vanishing completely, replaced by a sudden, heavy silence. She had no choice. To ignore it would be to lose her job, and her job was the key to her future. She turned, her face a carefully constructed mask of professional calm, and walked towards the table. As she approached, the man didn't look at her. He kept talking to his guests, a story about some business deal that involved a lot of numbers and very little soul. He only acknowledged her presence when she was standing right beside him, her tray held steady. He finally looked up, his eyes scanning her uniform with a quick, dismissive glance. He pointed a fat ring-adorned finger at his water glass. There, on the rim, was a tiny, almost invisible smudge. A fingerprint from a previous refill. "There's a smudge," he declared, his voice loud enough for the people at the next table to hear. A few of them turned to look. He leaned back in his chair, a smug little smile playing on his lips. "I suppose attention to detail isn't a priority for your line of work." The words hung in the air, sharp and cruel. A few of his guests let out short, sharp chuckles, the kind of laughter meant to please the person paying for the dinner. Clara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck, burning her cheeks. It was an old feeling, one she thought she'd gotten used to, but it never got easier. It was the sting of being seen not as a person but as a thing, a servant who had failed in her simple duty. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. But her hands, her professional, capable hands, remained steady. She kept her eyes fixed on the middle of the table, not daring to meet his gaze. "I am so sorry, sir," she said, her voice quiet but even. "I'll replace it immediately." She reached for the glass, her movements slow and deliberate, refusing to rush, refusing to let him see how deeply his words had cut. She placed the offending glass on her tray and turned to get a fresh one from the nearby station. As she walked away, she could feel his eyes on her back and the eyes of his guests. The uniform, which had been her camouflage, now felt like a brand, marking her as someone lesser. The hot shame began to cool, replaced by something else. Something harder and sharper. It was a tiny, glowing spark of anger, deep in her chest. She placed the smudged glass on the counter and gripped the edge of the wood, her knuckles turning white. She was not just a waitress. She was Clara, and one day the world would know her name. But for tonight, in this gilded cage, she was just the girl with the smudged glass. And as she took a fresh, crystal-clear glass, her eyes fell upon the grand piano sitting silently in the corner of the ballroom, waiting. The cool, smooth surface of the service station counter was a small comfort under Clara's hands. She closed her eyes for just a second, forcing the man's face, his smug smile, and the condescending tone of his voice out of her mind. She focused on her breathing, a slow, steady rhythm she'd learned from her music instructor. In through the nose, hold for 4 counts, out through the mouth. It was a technique for calming performance jitters, but it worked just as well for humiliation. The sting was still there, a hot, prickly feeling under her skin. But it was becoming more manageable, like a sharp pain dulling to a persistent ache. She was a professional. This was not the first rude guest she had ever encountered, and it would not be the last. She just had to get through the night. She picked up a clean cloth and polished the fresh water glass until it gleamed. Her movements methodical, a small ritual to reclaim her sense of control. Back in the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The little drama by the head table had been absorbed into the larger hum of the party, a tiny ripple in a big pond. Most of the guests had already forgotten it, their attention moving on to the next canap, the next piece of gossip. Clara stepped back into the fray, her mask of polite indifference firmly back in place. She moved with a renewed purpose, her eyes scanning for empty plates and glasses, her mind a careful blank. She was a ghost again, invisible and efficient. She avoided the far side of the room where the man was holding court, sticking to the tables along the wall and near the windows. She could still hear his voice, a low, booming rumble that seemed to carry over everything else, but she treated it like background noise. The same way she tuned out the generic jazz. Music playing softly from the hidden speakers, she was clearing a table of dessert plates. She realized she had to pass near his group to get to the kitchen. It was the quickest route, and her tray was heavy. She took a deep breath and plotted her course, a straight line that would take her within a few feet of his chair. She kept her head down, her eyes on her tray, focusing on the delicate balance of china and silverware. She was almost past him, a shadow in his periphery, when his voice boomed again, this time not at her, but for her benefit. "See, this is what's wrong with the world today," he declared, his voice laced with the confidence of a man who believes he is always the smartest person in the room. He gestured vaguely in the direction of the service area where Clara had just been. No appreciation for true craft, for real art, for things that take discipline and genius. He paused, letting the words sink in, his eyes scanning his guests to ensure he had their full attention. A few of them nodded eagerly, while others looked down at their plates, a flicker of discomfort on their faces. They think a job is just a job. Punch in, punch out. No passion, no soul. It's a transactional existence. Clara's steps slowed, but she didn't stop. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks again. He was still talking about her. He was using her, a person he didn't even know, as an example in his little performance. Her grip on the tray tightened. She wanted to keep walking, to disappear into the safety of the kitchen. But his voice pinned her in place. His gaze then drifted across the room and landed on the gleaming, black grand piano sitting in the corner. Silent and elegant under a soft spotlight. The hired musician, a young man in a tuxedo, was on a break, sitting on a nearby chair sipping a glass of water. A cruel, knowing smirk played on the wealthy man's lips. He had found his perfect example. That, he said, pointing a chubby finger at the instrument, his voice dripping with a reverence that felt completely fake. That is art. It takes a lifetime of dedication. It takes a soul that understands beauty and suffering and joy. It takes something the common person could never ever grasp. He let out a short, dismissive laugh. I bet half the people in this room, the ones who went to good schools and have every advantage, couldn't even play a simple tune on that thing, let alone our little waitress friend. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She stopped walking, frozen in the middle of the aisle. He wasn't just insulting her job anymore. He was mocking the very core of who she was. He was talking about her passion, her dream, the thing she poured every ounce of her energy and hope into. He was talking about the countless hours she had spent in dusty practice rooms, her fingers aching, her mind burning with concentration. He was talking about the sacrifices she had made, the social life she had given up, the cheap meals she had eaten so she could afford sheet music. He was taking the most sacred personal part of her life and using it as a punchline. She turned her head slowly and looked at him. He wasn't even looking at her. He was looking at his guests, preening, basking in their attention. He had no idea that his target was standing right there, listening to every word. He had no idea that the little waitress friend, was so casually dismissing, could probably play circles around anyone he had ever met. The anger she had felt earlier, the tiny spark in her chest, now erupted into a roaring fire. It was a hot, clean, powerful feeling that washed away the shame and replaced it with something else, something solid and unyielding. She looked from the man to the piano. It sat there, a beautiful, silent beast. In her mind, she could see her fingers on the keys, could hear the music that lived inside her. She thought of the Rachmaninoff concerto she was currently struggling with, the thunderous chords and soaring melodies that had kept her up at night. She thought of the delicate, haunting notes of a Debussy arabesque that could make a room weep. This man, with his expensive suit and his empty words, had no idea what art was. He thought it was something you could own, something you could use to make yourself feel superior. He didn't understand that it was something you lived, something that bled into every part of your life. The guests at his table were shifting in their seats, some of them clearly uncomfortable with the direction his monologue had taken. The man, however, was oblivious. He was on a roll, enjoying the sound of his own voice. It's a dying art, he concluded with a sad, dramatic sigh. Lost in a sea of mediocrity, Clara stood there, her heavy tray still in her hands. The world seemed to have narrowed to just her, the man, and the piano. The hum of the party faded away. The clinking of glasses and the murmur of conversations became a distant, irrelevant noise. She was no longer a ghost. She was no longer invisible. She was a person, an artist, who had just been publicly and deeply insulted. And in that moment, a crazy, reckless, wonderful idea began to form in her mind. It was a dangerous idea, an idea that could get her fired, an idea that was completely unlike her. But as she stood there, feeling the fire in her chest and the weight of the tray in her hands, she knew she had to do it. She had to show him. She had to show them all. The fire in Clara's chest was a living thing. It wasn't just anger. It was a righteous, burning indignation that spread through her veins, making her feel powerful and terrifyingly alive. The heavy tray in her hands suddenly felt light, its weight insignificant compared to the weight of the man's words. The common person could never ever grasp. The phrase echoed in her head, a mocking refrain. He had taken her entire life, her passion, her soul, and crammed it into a tiny, dismissive box labeled common. He saw the uniform, not the person. He saw the job, not the dream. And in that moment, standing in the middle of the grand ballroom, Clara made a silent, life-altering vow. She was going to show him what common could do. But how? The thought was a wild, untamed bird fluttering against the walls of her mind. She couldn't just walk up to him and say, "Excuse me, sir, but you're a fool, and I happen to be a gifted pianist." That would get her fired, escorted out by security, and it would change nothing. He would just laugh, and his guests would whisper about the crazy waitress who forgot her place. She needed a stage, a moment, an opportunity that she didn't have. She was just a girl with a tray of dirty dishes in a room full of people who saw her as part of the furniture. The fire in her chest began to sputter, faced with the cold, hard reality of her situation. She was trapped. With a sigh that felt like defeat, she turned to continue her journey to the kitchen. Just as she was about to step away, a new voice cut through the hum of the party. It was the host of the event, a kind-faced man with a gentle demeanor who had been watching the exchange with visible discomfort. He clapped his hands together lightly. Sound meant to be cheerful, but that came out a little too loud, a little too desperate. "Well, speaking of beautiful things," he said, his voice a forced buoyancy, trying to lift the heavy mood that the rich man had created. "I have a bit of unfortunate news. Our pianist for the evening has taken ill and had to leave. A terrible headache, I'm afraid." He gestured towards the empty piano bench, a look of genuine disappointment on his face. "We were so looking forward to some music. Does anyone else here play? We would be so grateful for some background music to fill the air." The question hung in the ballroom like a cloud of smoke. A hush fell over the nearby tables. Guests looked at each other, a mixture of curiosity and panic in their eyes. Some gave small, nervous shakes of their heads. Others suddenly found their drinks or their phone screens incredibly interesting. No one wanted to be put on the spot to risk embarrassment in front of this crowd. The silence stretched on, growing more and more awkward with each passing second. It was the silence of 100 people holding their breath, hoping someone else would be the first to exhale. From his throne at the head table, the rich man let out a loud, theatrical sigh. "See," he boomed, his voice dripping with a smug satisfaction. He was using the host's failed attempt at a mood change as another piece of evidence for his case. A dying art. No one has the discipline anymore. No one has the passion. It's all about instant gratification, about taking shortcuts. He took a sip of his wine, swirling the dark red liquid in his glass. It's a shame. A real shame. And that was it. That was the moment. The universe, in its strange and mysterious way, had just handed Clara the very opportunity she thought she didn't have. The host had asked for a volunteer. The room had remained silent. The man had just thrown another log on the fire of her indignation. It was a perfect storm of chance and circumstance. Her heart began to pound, a frantic, wild drumbeat against her ribs. A war erupted inside her. One voice, the voice of caution and practicality, screamed at her. "No, are you crazy? Think about your tuition. Think about your rent. You can't afford to lose this job. Just walk away. Go to the kitchen. He's not worth it. He's just a rich, arrogant man who will be gone in an hour. Forget him." But another voice, a quieter, stronger, more persistent voice, whispered from a deeper place inside her. It was the voice of the artist, the voice of the girl who had spent thousands of hours alone in a practice room. "This isn't just about him," it whispered. "This is about you. This is about every time someone has looked at your uniform and not your face. This is about every time you've been told your dream is impossible." He didn't just insult a waitress. He insulted music. He insulted the very thing that gives your life meaning. Are you going to let him get away with that? She stood frozen, her feet glued to the floor. The tray in her hands felt impossibly heavy again, a symbol of the life she was so afraid to risk. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, or maybe she just imagined it. She thought of her small apartment, of the worn-out keys of her own piano, of the feeling of playing a piece perfectly, of losing herself in the music until nothing else existed. That feeling was her truth. It was who she was. And this man, this stranger, had just tried to tell her that her truth didn't matter. The voice of caution grew louder, more desperate. You'll regret this. You'll be out on the street. Your dream will be over before it even begins. But the voice of the artist was calm and certain. If you walk away now, you'll regret it more. You'll always regret it. Slowly, as if in a dream, Clara felt her body begin to move. It wasn't a decision made by her brain, but by her soul. Her feet turned away from the kitchen. She walked to a small, empty table near the edge of the dance floor. With a steady hand, she placed her heavy tray of dirty dishes on the surface. The clink of the plates against the wood sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. It was the sound of her setting down her old identity, casting off the invisible cloak of the waitress. She took a deep, steadying breath, the kind she took before walking on stage for a recital. She straightened her back, rolled her shoulders back, and lifted her chin. She was no longer a shadow. She was a presence. She looked directly at the host, a calm, clear expression on her face. "I can play," she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It was quiet, but it carried a surprising weight and authority. It cut through the silence like a sharp, clean blade. Every head in the vicinity turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. All eyes were on her. The young woman in the simple black uniform who had just volunteered to step into the spotlight. From the head table, a sound erupted. It was a short, sharp, ugly bark of a laugh. It was the rich man. He was looking at her with an expression of utter disbelief and contempt, as if she had just told the most ridiculous joke he had ever heard. "You?" He scoffed, his voice dripping with scorn. "Don't be ridiculous, girl." The rich man's scoff was like a stone thrown into a still pond. The ripples of his contempt spread through the nearby guests, a few of whom offered nervous, pitying smiles in Clara's direction. They saw a young woman, a waitress, who was clearly out of her depth, trying to get a moment of attention. They saw the setup for a public failure. But Clara didn't see their pity. All she saw was the long, empty path to the piano, and at the end of it, a chance to speak her truth. She ignored the man completely. His words, his opinion, they no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered was the gleaming black beast waiting for her in the corner of the room. With each step she took, a transformation occurred. The simple black uniform, which had felt like a brand of shame moments earlier, now felt like armor. Her back, which had been slightly stooped in the posture of a server trying to be invisible, straightened. Her shoulders, which had been tensed with anxiety, relaxed and settled into a confident line. She was not walking to her doom. She was walking to her home. The room was utterly silent now. The clinking of glasses had stopped. The low murmur of 100 conversations had died. Every eye was on her. This was a different kind of attention than the usual invisible glance. This was a focused, intense stare filled with curiosity, skepticism, and a fair amount of anticipation for a train wreck. She felt their eyes on her. But instead of feeling exposed, she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. This was a stage, just like any other. The audience was different, the stakes were higher, but the principle was the same. As she reached the piano, she ran her hand gently over its smooth, polished lid. It was cool to the touch, a solid, reassuring presence. She pulled out the heavy bench, the wood scraping softly against the marble floor, sound that seemed to echo in the profound silence. She sat down, adjusting the bench with a small, practiced slide, until she was at the perfect distance. The moment her fingers touched the cool ivory keys, the world outside the piano vanished. The ballroom, the guests, the rich man, it all faded into a blurry, distant background. There was only her and the 88 keys, her loyal friends and confidants. Her hands, which had been carrying trays and wiping tables just minutes ago, now looked different. They were graceful, poised, and full of a latent power that everyone in the room was about to witness. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look at the sheet music, which was still on the stand from the previous pianist. She didn't need it. The piece she had chosen lived inside her, in her muscles, in her bones, in her soul. She chose Chopin's Etude Op. 10, no, 12, the Revolutionary. It was not a gentle, pretty piece. It was a war in musical form. It was a cry of fury, a testament to struggle, a storm of passion and defiance. It was the sound of being underestimated, of being pushed down and roaring back with everything you have. It was, she thought, the perfect response, and then she began to play. The first chords were not a gentle introduction. They were a thunderclap. A roar of sound that shattered the stuffy, polite atmosphere of the party like a hammer through glass. It was a raw, aggressive, and powerful statement that jolted everyone in the room. A few guests physically jumped. The rich man, who had been leaning back with a self-satisfied smirk, suddenly sat bolt upright, his eyes wide with shock. Was not the fumbling, out-of-tune melody he had been expecting. This was a force of nature. Clara's left hand began a furious, cascading run down the keyboard, a relentless, driving rhythm that was like the pounding of a heart filled with anger. Her right hand then entered, with a series of dramatic, soaring melodies that sang of sorrow and rage. Her fingers, which had seemed so ordinary, were now a blur of motion, dancing across the keys with a speed and precision that was almost inhuman. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was embodying them. Her body swayed with the music, her eyes closed, her face a mask of intense emotion. She was no longer Clara the waitress. She was a conduit for a powerful, universal story of struggle and resilience. The guests were completely mesmerized. The pity in their eyes had been replaced by awe. Their mouths hung open. Plates of food were left untouched. Glasses of champagne sat warming on tables. They had come for a boring corporate party, a night of networking and small talk. Instead, they were getting a concert that was more raw, more real, and more powerful than anything they could have paid for. The music filled every corner of the vast ballroom, washing over them, demanding their full and undivided attention. It was impossible to ignore. It was impossible to think about anything else. But the most dramatic transformation was happening at the head table. The rich man's smug facade had crumbled completely. His face, once flushed with wine and arrogance, was now pale. His mouth, which had been so quick to curl into a cruel smile, was now slack with disbelief. He stared at the young woman at the piano, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing and hearing. The common waitress he had so casually dismissed was a master of her craft, and her music was a direct, undeniable refutation of everything he had just said. He had tried to use art to feel superior, but now art was being used to show him how small he really was. He shrank in his chair, trying to make himself invisible, a complete reversal from his earlier behavior. He, the king of his little world, had been dethroned by a girl in a black uniform as the piece reached its climax. The music became a whirlwind of sound. Clara's fingers flew across the keys in a final, breathtaking flurry of notes, a torrent of emotion that was both beautiful and terrifying. It was the sound of a soul breaking free, of a spirit that could not be contained. She poured all of her anger, all of her humiliation, all of her dreams, and all of her strength into those final moments. The entire room was holding its breath, captivated by the sheer power and beauty of the performance. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Her hands came down on the final resonant chords and then lifted from the keys. The last note hung in the air, shimmering and full of emotion, before slowly fading into an absolute, stunned silence. It was a silence so complete and so profound that it was louder than any applause. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there in the wake of the musical storm, their minds and hearts completely blown away. The world had stopped, and the only person who had made it move was the girl they had all underestimated. The last note of the Chopin etude faded into the air, but its echo seemed to hang in the ballroom like a ghost. For a long, drawn-out moment, there was nothing but a profound, breathtaking silence. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, that has a weight and a texture of its own. Clara sat at the piano, her hands resting in her lap, her fingers still tingling from the exertion. A low, steady ringing hummed in her ears, the familiar aftermath of a powerful performance. She felt disconnected from her body, as if she had been hovering above the piano during the storm of music, and was only now slowly descending back into herself. Her chest rose and fell with deep, shaky breaths. She slowly opened her eyes, which she hadn't realized were squeezed shut. The world came back into focus. The blurry lights of the chandelier, the dark shapes of the tables, the faces of the crowd turned towards her, and what faces they were. The polite indifference, the casual curiosity, the pitying glances, all of it was gone. In its place was an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. Jaws were slack. Eyes were wide. A woman at a nearby table had a hand pressed to her chest over her heart, as if to keep it from leaping out of her chest. The room was frozen in a collective state of shock. They had come expecting a boring party, a background soundtrack to their conversations. Instead, they had been witnesses to something raw, something real, something that had reached inside them and shaken them awake. Clara looked at them, and for the first time that night, she didn't feel like a waitress. She didn't feel like an outsider. She felt seen. Then, from the back of the room, a single person began to clap. It wasn't polite, tentative applause. It was a single, sharp, decisive sound. Then another person joined in, and another. Within seconds, a wave of sound was building, growing in volume and speed, until it was a thunderous, deafening roar. It wasn't just clapping. It was an explosion of emotion. People were on their feet, their faces flushed with excitement, their hands beating together in a frantic, joyful rhythm. A standing ovation. Not the kind you give out of politeness at the end of a school play, but the kind you give when you have been truly moved. When your soul has been touched by something extraordinary. Clara watched them, her mind struggling to catch up. The sea of standing figures, the wall of sound, it was overwhelming. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down her cheek. She wasn't crying from sadness, but from a release of all the tension, all the anger, all the years of hard work that had led to this single perfect moment. She saw the other waiters and kitchen staff peeking out from the service doors, their faces beaming with pride. They were her people, and they were celebrating with her. She gave them a small, shaky nod, a silent thank you. In the middle of this adoration, one figure remained seated. The rich man. His face was a ghostly white, a stark contrast to the ruddy complexion he had earlier. The smug king was gone, replaced by a small, deflated man who looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. He saw the standing ovation, but he knew it wasn't for him. He saw the tears on Clara's face, but he knew they weren't tears of gratitude for his cruelty. He had tried to build himself up by tearing her down, and in doing so, he had only provided the stage for her to soar. He looked around the room, but no one was looking at him. He had become invisible, the very thing he had tried to make her feel. With a clumsy, jerky movement, he pushed his chair back and stood up. He didn't say a word to his guests. He just turned, his shoulders hunched, and walked quickly towards the exit. His retreat a pathetic, scurrying shadow against the wall of celebration. No one noticed him leave. As the applause began to subside slightly, a man made his way through the crowd towards the piano. It was the host, his kind face shining with emotion. He walked right up to Clara, who was still seated on the bench, looking a little lost in the aftermath. "My dear," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. He didn't offer his hand to help her up. He just stood there, looking at her with an expression of the deepest respect. That was one of the most beautiful things I have ever heard. I am so sorry for the way you were treated earlier. There is no excuse for that kind of behavior. Clara just shook her head, unable to find her voice. The host smiled gently. "You are not a waitress," he said, his voice firm and clear. "You are an artist. A true once-in-a-generation artist." He paused, then took a deep breath. "I am a patron of the arts at the City Conservatory. I know how hard it is for talented young people to afford their training. Consider your tuition paid for. For the rest of your time there, it would be my absolute honor." The words hung in the air. Tuition paid for. The mountain she had been climbing, shovel by shovel, shift by shift, had suddenly vanished. It was gone. The weight she had carried for years was lifted in an instant. More tears flowed, but this time they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She looked at the host, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Just say yes," he said with a warm smile. As the party began to slowly wind down, the atmosphere was completely different. The stuffy corporate feel had been replaced by a warm, creative energy. Guests came up to Clara one by one, not to ask for more wine, but to thank her. An older woman with diamonds around her neck squeezed her hand and said, "You reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place." A young man in a suit just shook his head and said, "Wow, just wow." Eventually, the crowd thinned, and Clara found herself alone again with the piano. She looked at her hands, the same hands that had carried trays and wiped down tables just an hour ago. They seemed different now. They seemed to have a power she was only just beginning to understand. She was still wearing the simple black uniform, but it no longer felt like a cage or a brand. It was just a piece of clothing. Her identity was not in what she wore, but in what she could create. She had walked into this room a servant and was leaving as an artist. The future was a vast, unwritten page, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. She was holding the pen. And she knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in her soul, that this was only the beginning.